You get $500, Dad. My son Brandon smirked at me, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. He flicked a crisp $100 bill across the mahogany conference table. It spun in the air before landing near my frayed sleeve. Take this as a bonus. Go buy yourself a coffin that does not look like a cardboard box. Beside him, his wife Vanessa giggled, checking her reflection in her phone screen, already mentally spending the millions she believed were about to hit their bank account. They sat there like royalty dressed in Italian silk and diamonds staring at me as if I were a stain on the expensive carpet of the law office. I did not touch the money. I did not speak. I just looked at the lawyer, Mr. Rothstein. Rothstein sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone. He had watched Brandon's performance without blinking. He adjusted his glasses, looked at Brandon, then looked at me. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating the laughter in Vanessa's throat. Rothstein placed his hand on the thick document in front of him. That was page 1, he said, his voice cold and sharp as a razor. Now let us turn to page 2. Brandon rolled his eyes, leaning back in his leather chair. Get on with it. We have a yacht viewing at 3. Rothstein turned the page. The sound of the paper flipping was like a gunshot in the quiet room. And in that split second, I saw it. I saw the exact moment my son's life ended. He just did not know it yet. Before I tell you what was on that page, you need to understand how a father ends up sitting across from his son, waiting for his destruction. My name is Augustus Sterling. I am 72 years old, a retired history teacher, and yesterday I walked into my ex-wife's funeral wearing a 20-year-old suit that smelled faintly of mothballs. It was a Tuesday in November gray, and biting, the kind of New York cold that settles in your bones. St. Patrick's Cathedral loomed above Fifth Avenue, its spires piercing the gloom. Catherine always loved the dramatic. Even in death, she had commanded the center stage of Manhattan. I stood at the bottom of the stone steps, feeling smaller than I had in years. The plaza was filled with black limousines, a sea of umbrellas and security guards with earpieces who looked more like Secret Service agents than funeral ushers. I adjusted my tie. It was too wide, out of fashion, just like me. I had not seen Catherine in person for 5 years, not since she became the face of global tech, the woman on the cover of Forbes, the billionaire who revolutionized artificial intelligence. To the world, she was a visionary. To me, she was just Kat, the girl who used to burn toast and laugh until she snorted. I took a breath and started climbing the steps. I just wanted to sit in the back. I just wanted to say goodbye. But before I could reach the heavy bronze doors, a hand slammed onto my chest. It was a security guard, a mountain of a man in a raincoat. Name, he barked. Augustus Sterling. I said, my voice raspy from the cold. I am her husband. Was. I was her husband. The guard looked at a tablet scrolling down a digital list. I saw his eyes scan my scuffed shoes, the fraying cuffs of my coat, the white hair that needed a trim. He did not find my name. He did not even look hard. Private event, he grunted. Family and VIPs only. Step aside, sir. I am family. I tried to argue, though the fight was already leaving me. I am Brandon's father. That is when I heard the laugh. It was a sound I knew too well, a sharp barking laugh that lacked any real joy. I looked up to see my son Brandon standing at the top of the stairs, under a massive black umbrella held by a chauffeur. He looked impeccable. 40 years old, handsome in the way predators are handsome, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my annual pension. Beside him was Vanessa, clutching a Chanel bag like a shield, her phone raised high, the red light of a recording app blinking. Look who crawled out of the history books, Brandon announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, my father, the man who taught me everything not to be. Vanessa zoomed in with her phone. I could see my own confused face reflected in her oversized sunglasses. Oh my God. Look at his shoes, she whispered, broadcasting to her 50,000 followers. Is he serious? This is a funeral for a billionaire, not a soup kitchen line. Brandon walked down 2 steps, stopping just out of reach, looking down at me with pure disdain. Go home, Gus, he said. He had stopped calling me Dad years ago. You are embarrassing yourself. Mom has been divorced from you for 30 years. You are not a widower. You are just a footnote, she erased. I looked at him, searching for any trace of the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders at the Science Museum. The boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. That boy was gone, buried under layers of greed and entitlement. I just want to pay my respects, Brandon, I said quietly. She was the mother of my child. She was the bank account. You were too stupid to keep, he sneered. You chose your little books and your quiet life. She chose greatness. You do not belong here. You do not belong in her world. Security, get this beggar off the stairs. The guard pushed me back. I stumbled, nearly falling onto the wet pavement. A few paparazzi cameras flashed, capturing the humiliating moment. The ex-husband was thrown out like trash. Brandon turned his back on me, taking Vanessa's arm, and they ascended the stairs like royalty entering their castle. I stood there for a moment, the rain soaking into my thin coat. I did not shout. I did not make a scene. I simply walked around the block, to the side entrance, the one tourists use. I waited until the heavy organ music started, slipped a $20 bill to a sympathetic janitor, and found a spot in the very last pew hidden behind a marble pillar. From the back, the service looked more like a coronation than a funeral. The cathedral was packed with tech moguls, politicians, and celebrities. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. I saw Brandon in the front row, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. To anyone else, he looked like a grieving son. To me, I knew he was checking his watch. He was performing, just like he had performed his whole life. I sat there and let my mind drift back 30 years. People think we divorced because of money. That is the lie Brandon tells. We divorced because I wanted a home and Catherine wanted an empire. We were happy once in a small apartment in Queens. I taught history, she wrote code. But then her first startup took off. The dinners stopped. The weekends disappeared. She started talking about scalability and market share instead of our son. I remember the day I left. I told her, Kat, you are running a race where there is no finish line. She looked at me with those steel blue eyes and said, Gus, you are just afraid to run. I took Brandon. I raised him. I was the one who went to the parent-teacher conferences. I was the one who taught him to shave. Catherine sent checks, big checks, and slowly the checks started to matter more to Brandon than I did. By the time he was 18, he looked at me, a teacher driving a 10-year-old Ford, and he looked at his mother flying private jets to Tokyo, and he made his choice. He followed the money. He left my house and never looked back. Now, sitting in the cold church, I wiped a single tear from my cheek. Not for the billionaire in the casket, but for the woman who used to eat pizza on the floor with me. I was the only one in that cathedral crying for Catherine, the person. Everyone else was mourning Catherine, the asset. The service ended. I waited until the crowd dispersed before slipping out. I knew I should go home to my small house in Jersey, feed my cat, and forget these people. But I needed closure. I needed to see where they were taking her. I took the subway and then a train out to the Hamptons where the reception was being held. It took me 3 hours. By the time I arrived at the gates of the seaside estate, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the manicured lawns. The driveway was lined with Bentleys and Ferraris. I walked up the long gravel path, the stones crunching under my worn soles. I could hear jazz music and the clinking of crystal glasses. It sounded like a party, a celebration. My wife was dead, and they were drinking vintage champagne. I reached the terrace doors. I saw them inside. A room full of vultures in designer suits. Brandon was standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in one hand, holding court. He looked flushed, excited. Tomorrow, he was saying loudly to a group of men who looked like bankers. Tomorrow, everything changes. 250 million liquid, plus the stock options. Gentlemen, your loans will be paid with interest. I told you I was good for it. He was celebrating. He was selling his mother's death to pay off his gambling debts. I knew he had debts. The rumors had reached even me. Failed businesses, bad investments, a lifestyle that burned cash like fuel. He needed this inheritance not to thrive, but to survive. I stepped into the room. The conversation died instantly. It rippled outward from the door until the whole room fell silent. Brandon turned. His face went from flushed to pale, then to a deep, angry red. "You," he hissed. "You are like a cockroach. You just don't know how to die." Vanessa rushed over, blocking my path. She smelled of expensive perfume and gin. "You need to leave," she said, her voice shrill. "You are ruining the aesthetic. Look at you. You look like you slept in a dumpster. This is a celebration of life, not a homeless shelter." I looked past her at my son. I just wanted to see her portrait, Brandon. I wanted to say goodbye to the house. We bought this land together, remember? Before the mansion. It was just a field. "Stop the nostalgia trip," old man Brandon snapped, striding over. He grabbed my arm, his grip hard and painful. "You have no rights here. You signed the divorce papers. You took your pathetic little settlement and you walked away. This is my house now. This is my money, my legacy." He shoved me toward the door. I stumbled, catching myself on a waiter's tray. A glass fell and shattered. The sound was sharp and final. "You are drunk, Brandon," I said, straightening my coat. "And you are grieving wrong." "Grieving." He laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "I am not grieving, Dad. I am winning. For 40 years I have waited in the wings. I have played the good son. I have endured her lectures and her control. Now it is my turn. The queen is dead. Long live the king." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. He shoved it into my chest pocket. "Here. $100. Take a taxi to the train station. Get a hot meal. Do whatever you people do. Just vanish. If I see you at the will reading tomorrow, I will have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at the money sticking out of my pocket. Then I looked at Vanessa, who was smirking, already typing something on her phone, probably another caption about the crazy stalker ex-husband. I looked at the bankers, who averted their eyes, ashamed to witness such naked cruelty, but too greedy to intervene. I took the bill from my pocket. I smoothed it out. I placed it gently on the nearest table next to a vase of white roses. "Keep it, son," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was breaking. "You are going to need every penny." I walked out into the night. I walked the 5 miles back to the train station in the dark. I did not look back at the mansion glowing on the hill. I sat on the train watching the reflection of a tired old man in the window. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was weak. But they did not know what I knew. They did not know that for the last 3 years, every Friday night, while Brandon was partying in Ibiza or Aspen, I was the one sitting by Catherine's bedside. They did not know about the cancer that ate her away slowly. They did not know that the great tech billionaire died holding the hand of the history teacher she divorced 30 years ago. They did not know what we talked about in those long, pain-filled nights, and they certainly did not know what was written on the second page of that will. The next morning, I arrived at the law offices of Rothstein & Associates 10 minutes early. I sat in the lobby watching the secretaries scurry about with coffee. At 10 o'clock sharp, the elevator doors opened and Brandon and Vanessa spilled out. They looked hungover but triumphant. Vanessa was wearing black, but it was a cocktail dress, cut low, entirely inappropriate. Brandon wore sunglasses indoors. They stopped when they saw me. "I told you not to come," Brandon growled, looming over me. I was invited, I said, not standing up. By the executor. Rothstein invited you for entertainment. Brandon scoffed. He probably needs a witness to see me sign the checks. Fine. Stay. Watch me become a quarter-billionaire. It might be the closest you ever get to real money. He threw the door to the conference room open and marched in. I followed. We took our seats. And then came the moment. The smirk. The $100 bill flicked across the table. The insult about the coffin. I watched Rothstein turn that page. I saw his eyes flicker up to meet mine. There was no pity in them. There was respect. He cleared his throat. Item 1. Rothstein read his voice filling the room. To my son, Brandon Sterling. Brandon leaned forward, licking his lips. Vanessa squeezed his knee, her knuckles white. I leave the contents of the safe deposit box number 404. Inside you will find every unpaid invoice, every settled lawsuit, every gambling debt, and every bail bond I have secretly paid on your behalf for the last 20 years. The room went silent. Brandon froze. Excuse me, he whispered. The total value of these debts. Rothstein continued reading from the ledger is $15 million. I have covered them to protect the family name. However, since you are now the head of the family, these paid receipts are my gift to you. A reminder of the freedom you squandered. Brandon stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. Is this a joke? Where is the money? Where is the trust fund? Sit down, Mr. Sterling. Rothstein commanded. I am not finished. Item 2. Regarding the liquid assets, the real estate portfolio, the stock holdings, and the intellectual property rights totaling approximately $250 million. Here we go, Vanessa whispered, her eyes wide and hungry. I leave the sum of $500 to my son Brandon, specifically to purchase a suit for his first job interview. Brandon's face turned a color I had never seen before. It was a draining of life, a gray, ashy white. No, he choked out. No. That is illegal. You cannot do that. Rothstein ignored him. He turned his gaze to me. And the remainder of my estate, the entire residuary, I leave to the only man who loved me when I had nothing. The only man who sat with me when I was dying and never once asked for a dime. I leave it all unconditionally to Augustus Sterling. Vanessa screamed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure horror. She looked at Brandon, then at me, her eyes bulging. You, she shrieked. You, Brandon looked at me. His mouth opened and closed. The arrogance was gone. The smirk was wiped clean. In its place was a terrified, empty void. Dad! He whispered, his voice trembling. Dad, tell them this is a mistake. I looked at the $100 bill he had thrown at me moments ago. I looked at the son who had just told me to buy a coffin. I stood up slowly, buttoning my old frayed jacket. I picked up the $500 check Rothstein had placed on the table. I walked over to Brandon. I placed it gently in his hand. Go buy a suit, son, I said. I hear the job market is tough. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand tall while someone tried to make you feel small. Because what happened next, the lawsuit, the media war, the dirty secrets that Brandon tried to use to destroy me. You are not going to believe how low a son will go when he loses $250 million. The office of Rothstein and Associates sat on the 50th floor of a glass needle piercing the Manhattan clouds. It was a place designed to make you feel insignificant, a cathedral of capitalism, where the carpet was thicker than my winter coat, and the silence was heavy with the weight of billable hours. I had arrived 20 minutes early, taking the service elevator because the concierge in the lobby had mistaken me for a delivery man. I did not correct him. It was easier to be invisible. Mr. Rothstein sat behind a desk, that looked like it had been carved from a single block of obsidian. He was a man who did not age. He simply hardened. We had not spoken much since I entered. He had offered me water in a crystal glass, which I declined, and then he returned to his paperwork, the scratching of his fountain pen, the only sound in the room. I sat in a leather chair that swallowed my frame, my hands folded in my lap, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. From up here, the people were just ants scurrying blindly. It was a perspective Catherine had loved. She always liked looking down. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp. The chimes faded, replaced by the low hum of the air conditioning. 10:15 passed. Then 10:30. Rothstein did not check his watch, but the line of his jaw tightened imperceptibly. I remained motionless. I had waited 30 years for this day. A few more minutes meant nothing to me. At 10:42, the double doors burst open without a knock. The sudden noise shattered the library-like stillness. Brandon strode in, bringing with him a gust of expensive cologne and the frantic energy of a man running on caffeine and greed. Vanessa trailed behind him, her eyes glued to her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen as if her life depended on the next caption. "Sorry we are late," Brandon announced, though his tone suggested he was not sorry at all. Traffic on the bridge was a nightmare. "We really need to get that helicopter service set up, Ness." He did not look at me. He threw his cashmere coat onto an empty chair and dropped into the seat at the head of the conference table, spinning it slightly to face the view. Vanessa collapsed into the chair next to him, sighing, as if she had just run a marathon. Whatever she muttered, finally looking up. "The lighting in here is terrible for a selfie." "Mr. Rothstein, can we open the blinds more?" Rothstein slowly removed his reading glasses. He looked at them with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying a new strain of bacteria. "The blinds are fully open," Mrs. Sterling Rothstein said, his voice dry. "And we have been waiting for 45 minutes. Time is money." "Rothstein," Brandon snapped, pulling out his own phone. "And speaking of money, let us wrap this up. We have an appointment at the McLaren dealership at 1. Ness, show him the one we are looking at." Vanessa swiped on her screen and shoved the phone toward the lawyer's face, ignoring the legal documents arranged perfectly on the desk. "It is the 765 LT, she said, her voice bright and brittle. "We are thinking volcano orange. It pops on camera. Brandon says it is a good investment car, right, babe?" "It is a statement car," Brandon corrected her, winking at the lawyer. "You know how it is, Rothstein. New money shouts, old money whispers. But when you inherit $250 million, you are allowed to scream a little." I sat in my corner, a ghost at the feast. They discussed horsepower and leather stitching with the casual entitlement of children who have never earned $1. They argued over the color of the brake calipers. They debated whether to get the convertible or the coupe. They spent $300,000 in their heads in less than 2 minutes, all while the man who raised them sat 5 feet away, wearing shoes with holes in the soles. I watched Brandon. I looked for the stress lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. I knew the rumors. I knew he owed money to people who broke kneecaps for a living. This bluster, this arrogance, it was a shield. He was terrified. He needed this money not to buy a McLaren, but to keep breathing. But instead of humility, fear had curdled into a monstrous pride. He truly believed he deserved this. He believed the universe owed him salvation because of his last name. Finally, Brandon seemed to remember I was there. He swiveled his chair around, his eyes landing on me with a look of mock surprise. "Still here, Gus?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "I thought you would have left when you realized there is no free lunch buffet." I held his gaze. I did not blink. I did not frown. I just looked at him with a profound, terrifying stillness. It was the look a teacher gives a student who is lying, the look a father gives a son who has crossed a line from which there is no return. I am waiting for the reading. Brandon, I said softly. Brandon laughed, a harsh barking sound. You are like a dog waiting for scraps under the table. It is sad, really. Look, when the wire transfer hits, I will write you a check. 5 grand. Enough to fix your teeth and get a heater for whatever shack you are living in. Consider it a severance package for being my biological father. Vanessa giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. You are so bad, B. Do not be mean to the elderly. It is bad karma. Karma, I thought, was a concept Vanessa was about to become very intimately acquainted with. Rothstein cleared his throat. The sound was like a gavel striking wood. If you are quite finished shopping for toys you do not yet own, Mr. Sterling, I would like to proceed. Brandon waved a hand dismissively. Go ahead. Read the boring parts. Just get to the number. The big number. Rothstein opened the thick leather binder in front of him. He smoothed the first page of the last will and testament of Catherine Sterling. The room grew quiet, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a held breath, the calm before the executioner drops the blade. Brandon leaned forward, his eyes hungry, his soul empty. I leaned back, my heart steady, knowing that the only thing Brandon was going to drive out of this office was his own ruin. Mr. Rothstein adjusted the microphone on the table, a small, unnecessary movement that signaled the beginning of the end. He did not look at the papers immediately. Instead, he looked at Brandon with an expression that I can only describe as forensic. It was the look a coroner gives a body before making the first incision. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the hard drive in the corner, recording every second of what was about to happen. Brandon drummed his fingers on the armrest, his patience fraying like an old rope. I, Catherine Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils. The legal preamble rolled off Rothstein's tongue like a spell. Vanessa shifted in her seat, smoothing her dress, her eyes darting around the room as if counting the invisible stacks of cash she imagined were hidden in the walls. Brandon leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his posture that of a man ready to receive a crown. Article 1. Rothstein read, his voice dropping an octave. Specific bequests to my son, Brandon Sterling. Here we go, Brandon whispered, winking at me. Pay attention, Gus. This is what success looks like. To my son, Brandon, I leave the contents of the gray metal box currently sitting in the archives of this law firm. This box is to be delivered to him immediately upon the reading of this clause. Rothstein pressed a button on his intercom. A moment later, a side door opened and a young paralegal walked in. She was carrying a battered, heavy banker's box. It was not a chest of gold. It was not a briefcase full of bonds. It was a cardboard box, dusty and taped shut, the kind you use to store old tax returns. She placed it on the table in front of Brandon with a heavy thud. Brandon stared at it. He looked at Rothstein, then at the box, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. What is this? A time capsule? Is the key to the vault inside? Rothstein ignored him. He turned a page in the binder, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence. Inside this box, Catherine's words continued through Rothstein. You will not find bearer bonds or diamonds. You will find the truth. You will find the receipts, the wire transfer confirmations, and the non-disclosure agreements for every single mistake you have made in the last 20 years. The smile slid off Brandon's face like oil off water. He sat back, his face paling. What are you talking about? He demanded. My mother respected my privacy. She cleaned up your messes. Rothstein corrected him, his voice devoid of emotion. And she kept the receipts. Allow me to summarize the contents of your inheritance, Mr. Sterling. Rothstein picked up a separate sheet of paper, lifting it into the light. Item 1. October 14th, 2018. The Bellagio Hotel, Las Vegas. Damages to the presidential suite and legal fees to prevent criminal charges for assault. $250,000. Paid by Catherine Sterling. Vanessa gasped. She looked at Brandon. You told me you won big that weekend. You said the hotel comped the room because you are a high roller. Brandon's face was turning a blotchy red. That is a lie. That was a misunderstanding. I handled that myself. You handled nothing. Rothstein said, his eyes never leaving the page. Item 2. The failed launch of your venture capital firm, Sterling Dynamics, in 2019. You claimed to investors that you exited with a profit. The truth is that the company was insolvent. Your mother quietly bought out the angry partners to keep you out of prison for fraud. Cost to the estate $4 million. I watched my son. He was shrinking. The arrogance, the bluster, it was evaporating under the harsh light of the truth. He had built his entire identity on the myth of the self-made man, the golden boy who turned everything he touched into success. Now Rothstein was peeling away the gold paint to reveal the rotting wood underneath. Item 3. Rothstein continued, relentless as a metronome. The paternity suit in 2021. Vanessa stood up so fast her chair tipped over. The paternity suit. You told me she was a crazy stalker. You told me the DNA test was negative. It was positive, Rothstein said calmly, and expensive. $1.5 million in a lump sum settlement, plus an NDA paid by Catherine Sterling to ensure your engagement to Vanessa would not be disrupted. Vanessa looked at Brandon with pure hatred. It was not the betrayal of infidelity that enraged her. It was the money. That was $1.5 million that could have been hers. She looked ready to claw his eyes out. That is enough, Brandon shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Stop reading. This is slander. My mother would never humiliate me like this. You forged this. I did not forge the $15 million in wire transfers, Mr. Sterling, Rothstein said. That is the grand total. $15 million. That is the sum of your failures. That is the price your mother paid to keep the name Sterling clean. She considered this prepaying your inheritance. The room spun. I looked at the box. $15 million. Catherine had spent a fortune covering up the cracks in our son's character. She had loved him in the only way she knew how, with money, and in doing so she had crippled him. She had never let him fall, so he had never learned to stand. Rothstein closed the folder on the debts. He took a breath. However, the will continues. Brandon looked up, a desperate, pathetic hope kindling in his eyes. Maybe this was just the lecture before the reward. Maybe the $15 million was just a deduction from a much larger prize. There is a cash bequest, Rothstein said. I knew it, Brandon breathed, wiping sweat from his forehead. Okay. Lesson learned. Now how much is left to my son Brandon, who has always appreciated the finest things in life without ever understanding their cost? I leave the sum of $500. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. 500 million, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. $500, Rothstein repeated. Specifically, Catherine requested that I hand you this cash immediately. Rothstein reached into his breast pocket and pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills. He fanned them out on the polished table. They looked small. They looked insulting. She noted Rothstein added, glancing at a footnote, that this should be sufficient to purchase a mid-range suit for your first job interview. She suggests you start looking immediately, as the allowance you have been receiving from her private accounts ceased at the moment of her death at 9:04 a.m. on Tuesday. Brandon stared at the money. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish on a dock, gasping for air that wasn't there. His entire reality, the foundation of his existence, had just been vaporized. No trust fund, no stocks, no safety net, just a box of evidence that he was a failure and $500. No, he croaked. This is a joke. This is a test, right? Mom is testing me. to see if I'm humble. It is a legal document, Mr. Sterling Rothstein said, closing the binder. And it is ironclad. The forensic accounting is complete. The debts are paid. Your inheritance has been spent. You are done. Then came the scream. It didn't come from Brandon. It came from Vanessa. It was a primal glass-shattering shriek of rage. She grabbed her Chanel bag and swung it at Brandon, hitting him square in the chest. The buckle caught his lip, splitting it open. "You broke fraud," she screamed, hitting him again and again. "You told me we were set for life. You told me I could buy the island. You owe everyone money. You are nothing." Brandon tried to fend her off, blood trickling down his chin. "Ness, baby, stop. We can fight this. We can sue." "Sue with what money?" she shrieked. "You don't even have $500, you idiot. That belongs to the suit store." She turned on her heel, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. She looked at Rothstein, then at me. For a second I thought she was going to attack me too, but she just spat on the floor. "I am calling my lawyer," she hissed. "I want an annulment. I am not staying married to a pauper with a paternity suit and a gambling problem." She stormed out the door, slamming so hard, the glass walls of the office vibrated. Brandon stood alone at the head of the table, clutching the cardboard box of his failure's blood on his lip, the $500 sitting untouched in front of him. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified realization of a child who finds himself alone in the dark. "Dad," he whispered. I did not move. I did not offer comfort. I just watched him, feeling a terrible, cold sadness. This was the boy I had raised. This was the man who had thrown me out of the funeral. Rothstein cleared his throat again. "We are not finished," he said. "Please sit down, Mr. Sterling. We still have to address the disposition of the residuary estate. The remaining $250 million. Brandon slumped into his chair, his eyes dead. "Who gets it?" he mumbled. "The cat shelter, the climate change fund. Burn it for all I care." Rothstein turned his head slowly. He looked directly at me. "No, Mr. Sterling. She did not leave it to a charity." The air in the room changed. It became electric. I felt my heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew what was coming, but hearing it, knowing it was real, felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet. "She left it," Rothstein said, "to the only person she trusted to use it wisely. To Augustus Sterling, my former husband and my only true friend, I leave the entirety of my residuary estate." Rothstein's voice was steady, a gavel striking down the final judgment. He did not look up from the document as he listed the assets, each one a hammer blow to the man sitting across from me. The penthouse on Park Avenue, the estate in the Hamptons, the controlling interest in Sterling Technologies, the diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, and the private trust. The total estimated value after taxes and the settlement of all outstanding debts is approximately $250 million. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. $250 million. It was a number so large it felt abstract, like the distance to a star. I sat frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests to keep them from trembling. I had known she cared. I had known she was grateful for those Friday nights spent holding her hand as the morphine dripped. But I never imagined this. I thought she might leave me the house in Queens or perhaps a small pension. This was not a gift. This was a burden. This was an empire dropped into the lap of a man who bought his suits at thrift stores. Brandon sat in absolute silence for 10 seconds. His face had gone from ash white to a deep, violent purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He looked from Rothstein to me, his eyes wide with a madness that terrified me. It was the look of a man watching his life burn down while someone else held the extinguisher. "You," he whispered the word, strangling him. "You, the history teacher. The loser who lives in a shack in Jersey. Mr. Sterling Rothstein began his tone warning. "Shut up!" Brandon screamed, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the water pitcher jumped. "You forged this. You manipulated her. She was sick. She was on medication. You snuck into her room when she was weak and you poisoned her mind against me." He stood up, kicking his chair back. It crashed against the wall, leaving a scuff mark on the pristine paint. He was panting, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked at me not as a father, but as a thief who had broken into his home and stolen his birthright. "She divorced you 30 years ago," he roared, spit flying from his mouth. "You were nothing to her. I am her son. I am her flesh and blood. I was the one who was supposed to run the company. I was the one on the magazine covers with her." "You were the one spending her money while she died alone," I said quietly. My voice was low, but in that acoustic vacuum it sounded like thunder. "I was there, Brandon. I saw the empty chair where you were supposed to be. I saw the unread text messages she sent you asking if you were coming for Christmas." "You liar," Brandon lunged. It happened in a blur. One moment he was standing at the end of the table, the next he was flying across the room, his hands reaching for my throat. He collided with me, knocking the wind out of my lungs. The chair tipped backward, and we hit the floor in a tangle of limbs and leather. I felt his hands clamp around my collar, shaking me violently. "Sign it over," he screamed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale scotch and fear. "Sign it over to me right now, or I will kill you." "You tricked her, you tricked her." I did not fight back. I lay there looking up into the eyes of the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the boy I had loved more than my own life. I saw no recognition in those eyes, only a bottomless black greed. "Security," Rothstein shouted, pressing a panic button under his desk. The door burst open, and 2 large men in dark suits rushed in. They grabbed Brandon by the shoulders and hauled him off me. He thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities, a wild animal trapped in a corner. They pinned him against the wall, his expensive suit bunching up, his face pressed against the silk wallpaper. I slowly picked myself up from the floor. My back ached. My old suit was torn at the shoulder. I brushed the dust off my knees. I felt a profound, exhausting weariness settle over me. It was the weight of knowing that my son was truly gone. He had not died, but the person I knew, the potential I had cherished, was dead. I looked at Rothstein. He was standing, adjusting his cuffs, looking at Brandon with cold distaste. "I will have you disbarred." "Rothstein," Brandon spat, his cheek squashed against the wall. "I will sue this entire firm into the ground. And you, old man, you think you won. You think this is over." I walked over to the table. I picked up the battered cardboard box containing the $15 million in paid debts. I walked over to where Brandon was pinned. I placed the box on the floor at his feet. "It is over, Brandon," I said. My voice was steady, void of anger, void of hate, just empty. "You spent your whole life waiting for a payday you did not earn. You thought wealth was a right. Catherine tried to teach you. I tried to teach you, but you never listened." I turned to the door. "I am going to sue you for undue influence," Brandon screamed, his voice cracking, tears of rage finally spilling over. "I will drag your name through the mud. I will tell the press you abused her. I will tell them you are senile. You will never see a dime of that money. I will tie it up in court until you die." I stopped at the threshold. I looked back one last time. "You can try, son," I said, "but you are fighting with a war chest of $500, and I have $250 million. I walked out of the office and into the hallway. I heard Brandon screaming behind the closed doors, a long, coherent string of threats and curses. I pressed the button for the elevator. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and watched the numbers count down. 50, 49, 48. I was descending back to the earth, back to the street level, back to reality. But the world I was returning to was not the one I had left that morning. I was now one of the richest men in New York. But as I walked out of the building and into the cold, gray afternoon, I had never felt poorer. I had the money, but I had lost my son. And as the cold wind hit my face, I knew the war was just beginning. Brandon would not stop. He was desperate, and a desperate man is capable of anything. He would come for me. He would come with lawyers, with lies, with everything he had left. I buttoned my torn coat. Let him come. I had something he didn't have. I had the truth. And for the first time in my life, I had the power to make it heard. The war did not begin with a bang. It began with the quiet, rhythmic thud of a stapler. I was sitting in my kitchen in Queens 3 days after the will reading. My house was a small 2-story box covered in vinyl siding that had faded from blue to a vague, dusty gray. It was the only place I had ever felt safe. The coffee in my mug was lukewarm. My cat, a one-eared stray named Barnaby, was asleep on the radiator. It was a morning of profound, heavy silence. Then came the knock. It was not the polite rap of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was 3 hard, authoritative strikes against the wood. I opened the door to find a man in a windbreaker standing on my porch. He did not smile. He shoved a thick manila envelope into my chest. "Augustus Sterling," he said, not asking a question, but stating a fact. "You have been served." He turned and walked away before I could even grip the paper. I watched him get into a nondescript sedan and drive off. I looked down at the envelope. It was heavy, dense with legal threats. I went back into the kitchen and tore it open. The header was bold and aggressive. Brandon Sterling versus Augustus Sterling. The lawsuit was filed by a firm I recognized from billboards near the airport, the kind that promised to get you millions for a slip and fall. The lawyer's name was Miles Slater. They called him the Vulture in the tabloids. He was a man who did not practice law. He practiced extortion. I sat down and began to read. The words on the page were like a funhouse mirror reflection of my life, twisted and distorted into something ugly. The complaint alleged undue influence. It claimed that I, a predator in a cardigan, had wormed my way back into the life of a vulnerable, senile woman. It claimed that Catherine had been suffering from advanced dementia, that she did not know what day it was, let alone how much money she had. It claimed that I had isolated her from her loving son, blocked his calls, and poisoned her mind with lies about his character. It painted a picture of Brandon as a devoted, heartbroken child kept away from his dying mother by a greedy ex-husband. It was fiction. It was a fairy tale written in legalese. But as I read the accusations, elder abuse, fraud, coercion, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They were not just coming for the money. They were coming for my name. They were coming for the only thing I had left of Catherine, the truth of our final years together. I put the lawsuit down. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a deep, simmering rage. I reached for the remote and turned on the small television on the counter. I needed noise. I needed to drown out the voice of Miles Slater in my head. The screen flickered to life, and there was Vanessa. She was sitting on a beige sofa in a morning talk show studio, clutching a tissue. She was wearing black again, but this time it was modest, high-necked, the costume of the grieving daughter-in-law. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Exclusive, the billionaire's stolen legacy." "He was a monster," Vanessa sobbed, dabbing at a dry eye. "We tried to see Catherine. We tried every day. We drove to the estate, we brought flowers, we brought her grandchildren's drawings. But he was always there. He stood at the gate. He told the nurses not to let us in. He changed her phone number. He controlled her medication." The host, a woman with a sympathetic frown, leaned in. "So you are saying this ex-husband, a man she hadn't been married to for 30 years, essentially held her hostage in her own home?" Vanessa nodded vigorously. "Yes. Exactly. He preyed on her. She was lonely. She was sick. And he saw an opportunity. He is a history teacher, you know. He knows how to rewrite the past. He convinced her that we abandoned her. It broke Brandon's heart. My husband hasn't slept in days. He just wants justice for his mother. He doesn't care about the money. He just wants to make sure her true wishes are honored. I stared at the screen. The audacity was breathtaking. Brandon didn't care about the money. The man who had priced out a McLaren in the middle of a funeral planning meeting, Vanessa looked directly into the camera. Her eyes were hard calculating. "If you are watching this, Gus," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "please, do the right thing. Step aside. Let the family heal. Do not make us drag your dark secrets into the light. We know about the drinking. We know about the anger." I turned off the TV. The silence rushed back in, but now it felt contaminated. The drinking, I had a glass of wine on Christmas. The anger, I hadn't raised my voice since 1995. They were not just twisting the truth. They were inventing a new reality, one broadcast to millions of homes. Then the first rock hit. It smashed through the front window of the living room, shattering the glass and sending shards flying across the hardwood floor. Barnaby hissed and bolted under the sofa. I stood frozen in the kitchen. Then came the shouting. "Thief, predator! Give it back!" I walked slowly to the broken window, crunching over the glass. I pulled back the curtain an inch. My front lawn, usually empty save for a few stray leaves, was a circus. There were news vans parked on the grass, their satellite dishes extended like antennas searching for filth. There were photographers with long lenses crowding the sidewalk, and behind them a small crowd of angry strangers holding signs. "Justice for Catherine. Stop elder abuse." Someone threw an egg. It splattered against the siding, a yellow yolk running down the gray vinyl like an infected tear. Another rock flew bouncing off the doorframe. I stepped back, letting the curtain fall. My sanctuary had been breached. I was no longer Augustus Sterling, the quiet retiree who grew tomatoes in the backyard. I was a villain in a national soap opera. I was the man who stole a fortune from a dying woman. I went to the front door and locked the deadbolt. It felt like a futile gesture, like trying to hold back the tide with a spoon. I could hear them outside, a low buzzing hum of judgment and excitement. They wanted a reaction. They wanted the angry old man to come out waving a cane so they could film it and prove Vanessa right. I retreated to the kitchen. I sat down at the table, pushing the lawsuit aside. I looked at my hands. They were old hands, spotted and veined, hands that had graded thousands of essays, hands that had held Catherine's hand while she slept. They were not the hands of a manipulator. I thought about calling Rothstein. I thought about issuing a statement. But what would I say? The truth is boring. The truth is quiet. The truth is sitting by a hospital bed for 3 years watching someone fade away. The truth does not sell ad space on morning talk shows. Brandon and Vanessa knew that. They knew that in the court of public opinion, the loudest lie always wins. I felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. I was 72 years old. I had $250 million in a trust fund I hadn't touched, and I was trapped in my house like a criminal. I looked at the broken glass on the floor. A cold wind was blowing in through the hole, chilling the room. I stood up. I went to the closet and got a broom and a dustpan. I began to sweep. The sound of the bristles against the floor was rhythmic, steady. Swish, swish, swish. Outside, they chanted my name. Inside, I cleaned up their mess. I did not know it then, but this was exactly what Brandon wanted. He wanted me to feel isolated. He wanted me to feel siege mentality. He wanted me to break, to pick up the phone and say, "Keep the money, just leave me alone." He was betting on my weakness. He was betting that the old teacher didn't have the stomach for a street fight. He was wrong. As I swept the glass into a pile, I wasn't thinking about surrender. I was thinking about the look in Catherine's eyes when she told me about the missing charity funds. I was thinking about the secrets she had entrusted to me, The leverage she had given me buried deep in the paperwork Rothstein held. I emptied the dustpan into the trash. I looked at the egg stain on the window. "You want a villain," I whispered to the empty room. I sat back down and pulled a notepad toward me. I picked up a pen. I wasn't going to go on TV. I wasn't going to scream on the lawn. I was going to do what I did best. I was going to do my homework. I wrote one name on the pad. Not Brandon. Not Vanessa. I wrote the name of the nurse Vanessa had mentioned on TV. The one who supposedly saw me control the medication. Elena Rosales. If Brandon was building a castle of lies, Elena was the cornerstone. And I knew something about cornerstones. If you pull them out, the whole thing comes down. I picked up the phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the press. I dialed a number. Rothstein had given me a number for a private investigator named Cole, who specialized in finding things people wanted hidden. "Mr. Cole," I said when he answered. "This is Augustus Sterling. I have a job for you. I want you to find a nurse. And I want you to find out how much her debt is." The war had started, and I was done sweeping up glass. The mob outside my window had grown louder. The chanting had settled into a rhythmic, ugly pulse that vibrated through the floorboards of my small house. They were calling me a predator. They were calling me a leech. A reporter with a megaphone was broadcasting live, painting a picture of a sinister ex-husband who had crept into a dying woman's mansion to steal her legacy from her grieving son. I closed the heavy velvet curtains, plunging the living room into a dim, dusty twilight. I did not turn on the lamps. I did not want them to see my shadow. On the coffee table sat the heavy manila envelope Mr. Rothstein had handed me privately after the chaos of the will reading. He had pressed it into my hands with a look of profound solemnity, whispering that Catherine had wanted me to read these when the storm broke. She knew there would be a storm. She always was the smartest person in the room. I sat down in my armchair, the leather groaning softly under my weight. My hands, usually steady, trembled as I broke the wax seal. Inside were a dozen handwritten letters. The paper was expensive, thick cream stationery, with her initials embossed in gold, but the handwriting was not the bold, slashing script of the CEO who had terrified Wall Street. It was shaky. It was the writing of a hand fighting a losing battle against tremors and morphine. I picked up the first letter. It was dated 3 years ago. November 14th. "Dear Gus," it began. I stopped. I had to close my eyes for a moment. No one had called me Gus in 20 years. To my students, I was Mr. Sterling. To the world, I was nobody. To Catherine, I was Gus. "I am dying," the letter continued. "The doctors used a lot of long words today. Oncology, metastasis, palliative. But the translation is simple. I have run out of road. I am sitting here in this 20,000 square foot house looking at the ocean, and I have never felt so small. I checked my phone 10 times this hour. I wanted to call Brandon. I wanted to tell him. But when I opened his contact, I saw our last text exchange. He was asking for a wire transfer to cover a deposit on a villa in Tuscany. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the biopsy. He just sent routing numbers. I put the letter down on my lap. The memory of that week washed over me. I remembered the phone call I had received late that night. It wasn't Brandon. It was Catherine. Her voice had been small, stripped of all its armor. "Gus," she had said, "I know I have no right to ask, but could you bring me some soup and not the chef's soup? Your soup." I drove out to the Hamptons that night in my rusted Ford. The security guards at the gate had sneered at me, but her name was on the list. When I walked into that master bedroom, a room larger than my entire house, I saw her. She looked like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. She was so thin. The powerful titan of industry was gone, replaced by a frightened woman under a heavy duvet. I heated up the chicken noodle soup I had made from scratch. the way we used to make it in our tiny kitchen in Queens when we were young and broke. I sat by her bed and fed her spoon by spoon. She didn't talk about business. She didn't talk about her millions. She talked about the time we got caught in the rain in Central Park. She talked about the smell of old books. I picked up the second letter. It was dated 6 months later. Brandon visited today, she wrote. The ink was blotchy here as if she had been crying. He stayed for 14 minutes. I timed it. He stood by the door the whole time looking at his watch. He told me I looked tired. He didn't touch me. He didn't kiss my cheek. He complained that the hospital smell in the room was ruining his appetite for lunch. Then he asked if I had updated the trust fund to include his new venture. He looked at me, Gus, and he didn't see his mother. He saw an ATM that was malfunctioning. I realized today that I raised a wolf, and now that I am wounded, he is circling. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek. I remembered that day too. I had arrived just as Brandon was leaving. He had almost run me over with his Porsche in the driveway. He hadn't even waved. I found Catherine staring at the ceiling, her face like stone. That was the night she asked me to read to her. Not newspapers, not financial reports. She wanted me to read history. She wanted to hear about the fall of Rome. She said she found it comforting to know that even the greatest empires eventually turn to dust. The stack of letters grew heavier in my hands. Each one was a confession. Each one was a piece of evidence in the trial of her heart. Gus, she wrote in a letter dated a year ago. You are the only one who doesn't want anything. The nurses are paid to be here. The doctors see me as a VIP patient. Brandon sees me as a bank vault. But you come every Friday. You drive 3 hours in traffic. You sit in this chair, and you sleep in the corner, and you never once asked me for a dime. I tried to give you a check last week, remember? You tore it up. You told me to use it to buy better pillows. That was when I knew. I knew I had made a mistake 30 years ago. I chose the climb, but I forgot to bring the person who made the view worth seeing. The chanting outside swelled. Predator, manipulator. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. They accused me of undue influence. They claimed I had twisted her mind. They didn't know that I was the only thing keeping her sane. I was the anchor in the storm of her terminal decline. While Brandon was posting photos of himself on yachts captioned "Living my best life," I was holding a basin while his mother threw up from the chemotherapy. While Vanessa was giving interviews about her close bond with her mother-in-law, I was the one wiping Catherine's forehead with a cool cloth, listening to her whispers of regret. I picked up the final letter. It was dated 3 days before she died. The handwriting was barely legible, a scrawl of spider webs across the page. My lawyer was here today, it read. We finalized the changes. I know people will hate you for this, Gus. I know Brandon will unleash hell. I am sorry for that. I am leaving you a burden wrapped in gold, but I cannot leave it to him. If I give him the money, I am giving him the means to destroy himself completely. He has never learned the value of $1 because he never had to earn one. The $500 is not an insult, Gus. It is a hope. It is a hope that if he has to start at the bottom, he might finally become the man we hoped he would be. I paused. She still had hope for him. Even at the end, after all the neglect, after the coldness, she was still a mother. She punished him to save him. And you, Gus, the letter concluded. I am leaving it to you because you know what enough means. You are the custodian of my memory, not my wallet. Do something good with it. And please buy a new suit. You looked handsome in blue. Love, Cat. I lowered the letter. The room was silent save for the muffled anger outside. I looked at my reflection in the dark television screen. I looked tired. I looked old. But for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel alone. Catherine was here. She was in these pages. She was testifying from the grave. The lawsuit sitting on my kitchen table claimed that I had isolated her. It claimed I had blocked Brandon's access. The truth written in her own dying hand was that Brandon had isolated himself. He had built a wall of indifference and greed, and now he was furious that he couldn't climb over it to get the prize. I stood up and walked to the window. I peeked through the gap in the curtains. The news vans were still there, their satellite dishes pointed at my house like weapons. A woman in a raincoat was holding a sign that said, "Justice for Brandon." If they only knew. Justice for Brandon was exactly what he got. A box of paid debts and a chance to grow up. But he didn't want justice. He wanted the payout. I went back to the table and gathered the letters. I placed them back in the envelope and resealed it. These were not just letters. They were my shield. Brandon's lawyers would argue that Catherine was mentally incompetent. They would bring in experts to say she didn't know what she was doing. But these letters proved otherwise. They proved she was lucid. They proved she was heartbroken. They proved she saw everything with a terrifying clarity. She watched her son wait for her to die, and she made a choice. I thought about the next step. Brandon had escalated the fight. He had brought the media to my doorstep. He had hired the vulture. He was betting that I would crumble under the pressure, that I would offer a settlement just to make the noise stop. He didn't know about the letters. Rothstein had been clever. He hadn't entered them into probate yet. He was holding them back, waiting for Brandon to commit to his lie. I picked up my phone. I dialed Rothstein's private number. Mr. Sterling Rothstein answered on the first ring. "Are you safe? The news says there is a crowd." "I am fine," I said. My voice was raspy but strong. "I just finished reading them. And we are not settling," I said. "Not a dime." "Good," Rothstein said. "I was hoping you would say that. Because Brandon just made a mistake." "What kind of mistake, huh?" "He filed an affidavit," Rothstein said. "A sworn statement. He claims he visited his mother every week for the last year. He claims they had Sunday dinners. He claims she promised him the money in front of a witness." "A witness?" I asked. "Who?" the nurse Rothstein said. "Elena Rosales. She signed an affidavit supporting his story. She says she saw you force Catherine to sign the new will while she was hallucinating." I looked at the envelope on the table. The letters told the true story, but a sworn witness was dangerous. A lie, if told under oath by a third party, becomes evidence. "Elena Rosales," I repeated. I remembered her. She was young, nervous. She always left the room when I arrived. She drove a new car in the last few months, a car a nurse's salary couldn't buy. "Brandon bought her," I said. "It appears so," Rothstein agreed. "And that is his mistake. Because a bought witness always has a receipt." I hung up the phone. I looked around my small, dark living room. The sanctuary was violated, but the fortress was strong. I had Catherine's voice in my hands. I had the truth. And now, thanks to Brandon's greed, I had a target. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I was going to find Elena Rosales. And I was going to remind her that perjury is a crime, but the truth is free. I went to my closet and pulled out my heavy winter coat. It was time to go out. The mob was waiting, but I had something to say. Or rather, I had something to do. I was going to save my son from himself, even if I had to destroy him to do it. The envelope that arrived the next morning was not delivered by a courier. It was brought by a sheriff's deputy. He stood on my porch, his face impassive, his hand resting near his holster, not out of threat, but out of habit. He asked for my identification. He checked the photo against my tired face. Then he handed me a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. It was a temporary restraining order and a motion for an emergency injunction. I took the papers into my kitchen. The window was still boarded up with plywood where the rock had come through. The room smelled of sawdust and old coffee. I sat down and began to read, and as I did, the floor seemed to drop out from under me. The court had ordered an immediate freeze on all assets of the Sterling estate. The transfer of the $250 million, which was scheduled to begin processing that afternoon, was halted. The accounts were locked. The properties were sealed. I was legally barred from entering the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, or the corporate offices. I was even barred from visiting Catherine's grave pending an investigation into the circumstances of her burial. But the freeze was just the headline. The story, the lie that had convinced a judge to sign this order, was buried in Exhibit A. It was a sworn affidavit. The name at the top was Elena Rosales. I remembered Elena. She was the night nurse. She was young, barely 25, with tired eyes and a nervous habit of chewing her lip. I had brought her coffee on those long Friday nights. I had asked about her daughter. I thought we shared a silent camaraderie, two people watching over a dying woman while the world slept. I was wrong. I, Elena Rosales, the affidavit read, being duly sworn, do depose and say as follows. I was the primary caregiver for Catherine Sterling during the final 6 months of her life. During this time, I witnessed Mr. Augustus Sterling visit the patient frequently. On the night of November 12th, 3 days before her death, I was in the room when Mr. Sterling arrived. I stopped reading. November 12th. That was the night Catherine signed the new will. But Elena hadn't been in the room. She had been on her break. I remembered because Catherine had waited until she left to call Rothstein. I forced myself to read on. The words blurred, swimming in a toxic soup of fabrication. The patient was in a state of advanced delirium, Elena claimed. She was heavily medicated on high doses of morphine and lorazepam. She did not know where she was. She kept calling out for her son Brandon. She was crying. She was terrified. My hands clenched the paper, crumpling the edges. Catherine had been in pain, yes, but she had been lucid. She had been sharper than anyone I knew right up to the end. She hadn't called for Brandon. She had explicitly told the security team not to let him in if he showed up drunk again. Mr. Sterling, the lie continued, dismissed me from the room, but I listened from the hallway. I heard him shouting. I heard him threatening to leave her alone to die in pain if she did not sign the papers. I heard objects being thrown. When I re-entered the room an hour later, Mrs. Sterling was catatonic. She was clutching a pen, and there were fresh bruise marks on her wrist. She told me he made me do it. He said he would hurt Brandon if I didn't. I felt bile rise in my throat. It was a masterpiece of fiction. It took my quiet devotion and twisted it into abuse. It took Catherine's strength and turned it into victimhood. It took the truth that I was the only one who cared and inverted it so completely that I barely recognized myself in the description. And the worst part, it was sworn under penalty of perjury. A judge had read this. A judge sitting in a quiet chamber had read these words and pictured a monster forcing a dying woman to sign away her legacy. No wonder they froze the assets. If I had read this about a stranger, I would have frozen them too. I turned the page. There was more. A forensic psychiatrist, a man who had never met Catherine, had attached a report based solely on Elena's testimony. He concluded that Catherine lacked testamentary capacity and was a victim of coercive control. He used words like undue influence and psychological manipulation. He painted me as a Svengali who had swooped in to prey on a vulnerable billionaire. I dropped the papers on the table. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of this accusation. It wasn't just about the money anymore. If this lie became the official record, I wouldn't just lose the inheritance. I would lose my history. I would lose the last 3 years of my life. The world would remember me not as the man who loved Catherine, but as the man who abused her. My phone rang. It was Rothstein. "You saw it?" he asked. His voice was tight-clipped. "I saw it," I said. It is a lie, Rothstein. Every word. Elena wasn't even in the room. I know that, Gus. And you know that. But the judge doesn't know that. Brandon played this perfectly. He didn't just sue you. He nuked the bridge. He has a witness. A sympathetic working-class mother who has nothing to gain ostensibly by lying. She has something to gain, I said, staring at the plywood on my window. She has debt. We need to prove it, Rothstein said, and we need to do it fast. The temporary injunction hearing is in 10 days. If we don't discredit her testimony, by then the judge could make the freeze permanent pending a full trial. A trial could take years, Gus. Brandon will drain the estate with legal fees while you starve. He is banking on you giving up. He thinks you will settle for a few million, just to make it go away. I am not settling, I said. Good. But you need to understand the position we are in. You are toxic right now. The press has the affidavit. It leaked an hour ago. I walked to the window and peered through the crack in the plywood. The crowd outside had doubled. They weren't just shouting anymore. They were quiet, staring at my house with a dark, intense hatred. They had read the story. They thought I was a wife-beater. They thought I was a monster. A news van was projecting a picture of Catherine onto the side of my house, her face glowing on the vinyl siding like a ghost haunting her tormentor. I hung up the phone. I felt a wave of dizziness. I sat down on the floor, my back against the cabinets. I was 72 years old. I had lived a life of integrity. I had paid my taxes. I had graded papers fairly. I had returned lost wallets. And now, at the end of my life, I was being stripped of my name. Brandon had won the first round. He had taken the high ground of morality built on a foundation of perjury. He had turned the narrative so effectively that even if I won the money later, I would never be clean. I would always be the guy who maybe possibly forced a dying woman's hand. I closed my eyes and thought of Catherine. I thought of the night she died. She had gripped my hand so hard her knuckles were white. She had whispered, "Do not let him win, Gus. He will burn it all." She wasn't talking about the money. She was talking about the truth. Brandon was an arsonist of reality. He burned down the past to build a future that suited him. I opened my eyes. I looked at the affidavit again. Elena Rosales. Why Elena? I asked the empty room. I knew the answer. Money. Brandon didn't have $500 to buy a suit. But he had connections. He had promises. He had the desperate charisma of a con man. He must have promised her a cut, a percentage of the empire. Or maybe he just paid her cash borrowed from the same loan sharks he was trying to pay off. The hopelessness began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't a legal battle. It was a street fight. Rothstein could file motions, he could argue precedent, but that wouldn't clear my name. I needed to break the witness. I stood up. My knees popped. I felt every year of my age, but I also felt something else. I felt the anger of the innocent. It is a powerful fuel. I went to my desk and pulled out a map of the city. I circled the hospital where Catherine had died. I circled the neighborhood where Elena lived, a detail I remembered from our late-night talks. She lived in Queens, not far from here. I grabbed my coat. I wasn't going to wait for the private investigator to call me back. I wasn't going to wait for the court hearing. I was going to look the liar in the eye. I slipped out the back door, climbing over the neighbor's fence to avoid the reporters out front. I moved through the alleyways, a ghost in my own neighborhood. I walked to the subway station, keeping my head down, my hat pulled low. I was Augustus Sterling. I was worth $250 million on paper and $0 in the court of public opinion. I had lost my reputation. I had lost my peace. I was at risk of losing everything. But as I swiped my Metro card, I realized I had one advantage Brandon didn't account for. I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. I was going to find Elena, and I was going to find out exactly how much her soul cost. The settlement offer sat on my kitchen table like a dead rat. It had arrived via courier an hour ago, enclosed in a heavy linen envelope that smelled of lavender and hypocrisy. Mr. Rothstein sat across from me, his hands folded over his briefcase, watching me stare at the paper. $10 million, Rothstein said, his voice neutral. And a public apology. They will issue a statement retracting the abuse allegations. They will say it was a misunderstanding caused by grief. In exchange, you relinquish all claims to the Sterling estate, vacate the will, and sign a non-disclosure agreement that binds you for eternity. I looked at the number. $10 million. It was more money than I had earned in 40 years of teaching history. It was enough to fix the roof, buy a new car, and live out my days in a warm climate where no one knew my name. It was the easy way out. It was the exit door Brandon had cracked open, hoping I was tired enough to walk through it. He is scared, I said, pushing the paper away. He is practical, Rothstein corrected. He knows a trial will take years. He knows the affidavit from the nurse is shaky ground, even if it got him the injunction. He wants his money now. He wants the yachts and the parties. He is willing to throw you a crumb to get the whole cake. I stood up and walked to the sink to rinse my mug. My hands were steady. The trembling that had plagued me since the funeral was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. If I sign that paper, I said, turning back to the lawyer, I am admitting that I stole it in the first place. I am admitting that Catherine was incompetent. I am selling her memory for $10 million. Rothstein nodded slowly. He did not smile, but the lines around his eyes softened. That is the legal reality, yes. It is a settlement. It implies guilt on both sides, or at least a desire to avoid the truth. I picked up the offer and tore it in half. Then I tore it again. The sound was satisfying, a dry, ripping noise that filled the small kitchen. Tell him no, I said. Tell him I do not want his hush money. I want the truth. And tell him something else. Tell him I am done playing defense. Rothstein allowed himself a small shark-like smile. I was hoping you would say that, Gus. Because while you were reading that insult of an offer, I took the liberty of making a phone call. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a different file. This one was plain utilitarian. You were right about Brandon, Rothstein said. He is desperate. The $15 million in debt Catherine paid off was just the tip of the iceberg. A man like Brandon does not stop spending just because the well runs dry. He finds new wells. I believe he found one before Catherine died. What do you mean? I mean that for the last 6 months of her life, while Catherine was too weak to review the quarterly reports, Brandon appointed himself as the interim director of the Sterling Hope Foundation. The charity, I whispered. Catherine's cancer charity. Exactly. It has an endowment of $50 million. It is supposed to fund pediatric oncology research. But I have heard rumors. Rumors of vendors who do not exist. Rumors of galas that cost millions but raised pennies. I felt a surge of disgust. Stealing from his mother was one thing. Stealing from sick children was a level of depravity I hadn't thought even Brandon was capable of. We need to prove it, I said. We do, Rothstein agreed. But regular audits take months. And we do not have months. The hearing is in 9 days. We need a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. We need someone who can look at a spreadsheet and see the crime scene. That afternoon, my small house became a war room. Rothstein brought in 2 people who looked like they belonged in a spy novel, not a teacher's kitchen. The first was Cole, the private investigator I had spoken to on the phone. In person, he was unassuming, a man in a beige coat who looked like he could blend into any crowd. He had the tired, cynical eyes of someone who had seen every variety of human sin. The second was a woman introduced only as Ms. Sterling. No relation, she assured me with a dry handshake. She was a forensic accountant. She was small, sharp, and terrifyingly intense. She didn't sit down. She paced the kitchen, setting up a laptop on my counter, connecting to a secure server via a dongle she produced from her pocket. "Here is the situation," Ms. Sterling said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Brandon is not smart, but he is surrounded by people who are. He didn't just take cash out of the safe. He used shell companies. He used consulting fees. He used construction contracts for clinic wings that were never built." She turned the laptop screen toward me. It was a spiderweb of transactions, lines of red and green crossing over each other. "This is the cash flow of the foundation for the last fiscal year," she explained. "See this $500,000 to a company called Aurora Consulting for strategic branding. The company was registered 3 days before the check was cut. The registered address is a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands." "Who owns Aurora Consulting?" I asked. Ms. Sterling tapped a key. A document popped up. It was a corporate registration form. The owner was listed as a holding company, which was owned by a trust, which was managed by a law firm in Panama. "It is a dead end," Cole grunted from the table. "Standard layering. It is a dead end for the IRS." Ms. Sterling corrected. "But not for us. Because Brandon is lazy. Look at the signature on the authorization form." I leaned in. The signature was a scrawl, barely legible. "It looks like Catherine's signature," I said. "It is a stamp," she said triumphantly. "It is a digital stamp of her signature." Catherine never used stamps for checks over $10,000. She insisted on signing them with a fountain pen. It was one of her quirks. I nodded. I remembered that. She said ink had a soul. "Brandon had access to her digital signature files," Ms. Sterling continued. "He used it to authorize transfers while she was in a coma. He drained the liquidity of the charity to pay off his own urgent debts before the will reading. He assumed he would inherit the main estate and pay it back, or just bury the evidence." "How much?" I asked. "Preliminary estimate. $5 million. Maybe more. $5 million. He had stolen $5 million from dying children while his mother lay dying in the next room. And now he was suing me for undue influence. The hypocrisy was so vast it was almost impressive." "This is our smoking gun," Rothstein said quietly. "If we can prove he embezzled from the charity, we not only destroy his credibility in probate court, we send him to federal prison. The lawsuit against you vanishes. The freezing order lifts. But we need to link him to the offshore account," Cole said. "The stamp proves unauthorized use, but it doesn't prove the money went to him. He could claim he was scammed by a vendor. We need to catch him holding the bag." "How do we do that?" I asked. "We follow the lifestyle," Cole said. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "A man who steals $5 million doesn't put it under his mattress. He spends it, or he uses it to plug a hole. I need to find the hole." Cole pulled out a notepad. "I am going to track every movement Brandon made in the last 6 months. Every flight, every hotel, every text message I can get my hands on. I have a contact at his cell provider. It is not exactly legal, but neither is theft." "Do it," I said. I looked at the three of them. The lawyer, the spy, and the accountant. They were mercenaries paid to fight. But looking at their faces, I saw something else. They were angry. They were offended by the sheer ugliness of what Brandon had done. "I want you to dig until you hit bedrock," I told them. "I don't care what it costs. I have savings. I have my pension. Use it all." "We will work on contingency," Mr. Sterling Rothstein said. "We get paid when you get your inheritance, and when Brandon is in handcuffs." Ms. Sterling went back to her typing, the sound like rapid gunfire. Cole made a phone call, speaking in low-coded tones. Rothstein began drafting subpoenas. I sat back in my chair. Outside, the sun was setting. The crowd of reporters had thinned out, bored by my lack of reaction. They didn't know that inside this shabby house the counterattack had begun. I wasn't just a retired teacher anymore. I wasn't just a grieving ex-husband. I was the CEO of a takedown operation. Brandon thought he was fighting an old man who wanted to garden. He didn't realize he was fighting a man who had graded papers for 40 years. I knew how to spot a cheater. I knew how to check sources. And I knew that eventually every cheater gets lazy. "Find the nurse too," I said to Cole as he stood up to leave. "You think she is connected to the embezzlement?" Cole asked. "I think Brandon paid her with stolen money," I said. "And if he paid her with charity money to lie about his mother, that is not just fraud. That is evil." Cole nodded. "I will find her." The team dispersed into the night, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was charged. It was the silence of a fuse burning down. I looked at the picture of Catherine I kept on the fridge, a snapshot from 1985. Her hair wind-blown, laughing on a beach. "Hold on, Kat," I whispered. "I am going to clean up the mess." I went to bed early that night. I needed my rest. Because tomorrow I wasn't just reading letters or dodging reporters. Tomorrow I was going hunting. The kitchen of my small house in Queens had transformed into a bunker. The air was thick with the hum of electronics and the stale smell of cold pizza. It was 3 in the morning. The world outside was asleep, but inside we were dissecting the anatomy of a crime. Ms. Sterling sat hunched over her laptop, her face illuminated by the blue glow of spreadsheets that seemed to scroll on forever. Cole was pacing the linoleum floor, a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, rapid murmur to a contact in Nevada. Mr. Rothstein sat at the kitchen table, his tie undone, looking like a general waiting for the casualty report. I stood by the coffee maker brewing the 4th pot of the night. I watched the dark liquid drip into the carafe, thinking about the nature of excavation. As a history teacher, I had spent my life teaching students about the fall of empires. I taught them that collapse rarely happens overnight. It happens slowly, a crack in the foundation that widens until the whole structure gives way. Brandon was an empire of one, and we were looking for the crack. "Got it," Ms. Sterling said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of triumph, heavy with the weight of what she had found. We all froze. Cole hung up his phone. Rothstein leaned forward. I walked over to the counter, my heart hammering a slow, dreadful rhythm against my ribs. Ms. Sterling pointed to a line on the screen. It was highlighted in red. "We traced the transfer from the Sterling Hope Foundation to Aurora Consulting," she explained, her finger tracing the digital path. $5 million for strategic branding. We knew that part. But I just cracked the encryption on the Aurora bank account in the Caymans. They got sloppy. They used the same IP address to access the offshore account as they did to access Brandon's personal email. And Rothstein asked, "Where did the money go?" "It didn't stay in the Caymans," she said. "It bounced. Within 24 hours of landing in the Aurora account, it was wired out again to a corporate entity called Apex Holdings LLC. "Apex Holdings," Cole said, his voice grim. "I know them." "You do?" I asked. Cole nodded. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Apex Holdings isn't a company, Gus. It is a debt collection front. It is owned by a syndicate operating out of Atlantic City. They handle the markers for high-stakes private poker games. The kind of games that don't have limits and don't report to the Gaming Commission." The room went silent. The refrigerator hummed. "You are telling me," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, "that my son sent $5 million of charity money to a bookie?" "He didn't just send it," Cole said. "He was paying off a marker. I made some calls while Ms. Sterling was digging. The word on the street is that Brandon had a very bad run 6 months ago. He was leveraging everything. He was betting on futures. He was betting on sports. He was sitting at tables with sharks who eat whales for breakfast. He got in deep. 5 million deep." Rothstein took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked suddenly very old. He stole from the cancer fund to pay a gambling debt, Rothstein murmured. That is federal wire fraud. That is money laundering. That is 20 years in prison minimum. But why now, I asked. Why steal it right before she died? Because of the audit, Ms. Sterling said. She tapped a key and brought up a calendar. The Foundation's fiscal year ends on December 31st. The annual external audit is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. The pieces slammed together in my mind, forming a picture so ugly I wanted to look away. But I couldn't. I had to look. He took the money when Catherine went into the coma, I said, realizing the timeline. He knew she wouldn't check the accounts. He paid off the sharks to save his legs. But he knew the auditors were coming in December. Exactly, Rothstein said. He created a $5 million hole in the charity's balance sheet. If the auditors see that money missing, they call the FBI. He needs to fill the hole before they get there. He needs the inheritance, I whispered. It wasn't just greed. It was survival. Brandon wasn't fighting me for the penthouse or the prestige. He was fighting for his life. He needed access to the $250 million so he could quietly slip $5 million back into the foundation before anyone noticed. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, but Peter was a dying mother, and Paul there was a federal indictment. I looked at the screen again. I looked at the line item where the money had come from. Pediatric Oncology Research Grant, 404. That number meant something. I remembered Catherine talking about it. That grant was supposed to fund a clinical trial for a new leukemia treatment. It was money meant to save children who had run out of options. He stole their time, I said. He didn't just steal numbers. He stole medicine. He stole hope. I felt a physical sickness wash over me. I walked to the sink and gripped the porcelain edge. I thought I knew my son. I thought he was selfish. I thought he was entitled. I thought he was weak, but this was a level of moral rot that I couldn't comprehend. To look at a ledger of money meant for dying children and see it as a personal piggy bank. To take that money and throw it onto a felt table in Atlantic City. This explains everything, Rothstein said, his voice hardening. It explains the aggression. It explains the lawsuit. It explains why he is trying to freeze the assets. He is terrified. If you get control of the estate, you will see the books. You will see the theft. He had to stop you. He had to paint you as incompetent or abusive so he could get an emergency executor status. He thought if he could get control even for a week, he could cook the books and cover his tracks. He is cornered, Cole said, and a cornered rat bites. I turned away from the sink. The sadness was gone. It had been burned away by a cold, white-hot fury. I looked at the team assembled in my kitchen. He isn't going to get the chance to cover it up, I said. Ms. Sterling looked up at me. We have the digital trail, Gus, but it is circumstantial. He could claim identity theft. He could claim he was hacked. We need to tie him to the act. We need a witness who saw him do it. The nurse, I said. Cole nodded. Elena Rosales. If Brandon was forging digital signatures and moving millions while Catherine was dying, he needed privacy. He needed access to her computer. He needed someone to look the other way. He paid her, I said. I know he did, but he didn't pay her with his own money. He doesn't have any. Ms. Sterling's fingers flew across the keyboard again. I am checking the transfers again, she said. Here, look at this. 2 days after the $5 million went to the Cayman Islands, there was another transfer. Smaller, $50,000. It went to a shell company called Nightingale Services. Nightingale, I repeated, like Florence Nightingale. The nurse. I bet if we dig into Nightingale Services, we find Elena's name on the incorporation papers, Cole said. or her husband's, or her cousin's. Find it, I commanded. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain a fraction of an inch. The news vans were still there, dark shapes in the pre-dawn light. They were waiting for a scandal. They were waiting for the story of the evil ex-husband. They had no idea what story was actually waiting for them. Brandon had built a bomb. He had packed it with lies, with theft, with the suffering of children. And he had handed me the detonator. He thought he could bully me. He thought he could bury me under legal paperwork and public shame. He forgot one thing. He forgot that I was the one who taught him history. And history teaches us that the truth is the only thing that survives the fire. I turned back to the room. Print it all out, I said. Every spreadsheet, every bank transfer, every IP address log. Make 3 copies. One for us. One for the district attorney. And the third, Rothstein asked. The third is for me, I said. I am going to pay a visit to Elena Rosales, and I am going to show her exactly what kind of man she sold her soul to. I grabbed my coat. The sun was just starting to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. It was a new day, and it was Judgment Day. Brandon wanted a war. He wanted to destroy my reputation. Fine. But he had made a fatal error. He had underestimated the resolve of a man who has seen the darkness and decided to light a match. I am going to get my son, I said to the empty air as I walked out the back door. But I am not going to save him. I am going to stop him. Because someone has to speak for the children who didn't get their medicine. Someone has to speak for Catherine. And God help me that someone is going to be his father. The diner was called the Stop and Sit. It was one of those places that smelled of grease and lemon cleaner, a sanctuary for the night shift workers of Queens. It was 4 a.m. Outside, the rain was turning the city into a watercolor painting of gray and black. Inside, it was warm and quiet. I sat in a booth near the back, nursing a cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. I wasn't there for the food. I was there for the woman sitting 3 booths away. Elena Rosales looked older than 25. The harsh fluorescent lights were unkind to her, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders slumped as if she were carrying the weight of the sky. She was wearing her scrubs, blue with cartoon bears on the pocket. She was staring into her phone, her thumb scrolling mindlessly, her face a mask of exhaustion and anxiety. She looked like a woman waiting for a bomb to go off. I picked up my coffee and walked over to her booth. I moved slowly, making sure my footsteps were audible. I didn't want to startle her. I wanted her to see me coming. "May I sit down?" "Elena," I asked. She looked up. Her eyes went wide. She dropped her phone on the table with a clatter. For a second, I thought she was going to scream or run. She looked at the door, then back at me, her breathing turning shallow. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered. You can't be here." "The lawyers said." "The lawyers say a lot of things," I said, sliding into the booth opposite her. "They say I abused Catherine. They say I forced her hand. They say you saw it all. I have to go," she stammered, grabbing her purse. "I can't talk to you. It is illegal." "It is not illegal to talk, Elena," I said gently. "It is illegal to lie under oath. But we are not in court right now. We are just 2 people having coffee. 2 people who both cared about Catherine." She froze. She looked at me, searching for anger for the monster Brandon had painted me to be. But I wasn't angry. I was just sad. I saw the fear in her eyes, and I recognized it. It wasn't the fear of a criminal caught in the act. It was the fear of a mother who has run out of options. "I know about Sophia," I said. The name hit her like a physical blow. She stopped moving. Her hand hovered over her purse strap. What she breathed. "Your daughter," I said. "Sophia." She is 4 years old. She has a congenital heart defect, pulmonary atresia. She needs a valve replacement. Your insurance denied the claim because it was a pre-existing condition or some other bureaucratic nightmare. The surgery costs $80,000. You have been working double shifts for 2 years trying to save up, but you are barely making a dent. Tears welled up in her eyes, instant and hot. She looked down at her hands, her knuckles white. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "I do my homework," I said. "And I know that 3 weeks ago you were desperate. The hospital told you they couldn't schedule the surgery without a deposit. You were watching your little girl turn blue when she cried, and you didn't know what to do. And then Brandon Sterling walked into the room." She squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear escaped, tracking through the makeup she hadn't had time to wash off. "He promised me," she said, her voice barely audible. "He said, if I signed the paper, just signed one paper, he would give me $50,000. He said it was just a family dispute. He said you were trying to steal his inheritance. He said his mother was confused anyway, so it wasn't really a lie. He said he was the rightful heir, and he would make sure Sophia got the best doctors." I nodded. It was exactly what I had suspected. Brandon hadn't bought her with greed. He had bought her with hope. He had weaponized her love for her child against her conscience. "Did he give you the money, Elena?" I asked. She opened her eyes. They were full of panic. He gave me $5,000 cash. He said the rest would come after the court hearing, after the assets were frozen. He said he just needed access to the accounts." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the file Ms. Sterling had compiled. I slid it across the sticky table. "Open it," I said. She hesitated, then opened the folder. The first page was a printout of the bank transfer from the Cayman Islands. "Do you see that company, Nightingale Services?" I asked. "That is the shell company Brandon used to pay you the $5,000. Do you know where that money came from?" She shook her head, terrified. "It came from the Sterling Hope Foundation," I said. "It came from a grant meant for pediatric leukemia research. He didn't pay you with his money, Elena. He stole money meant for sick children to pay you to lie so he could save your sick child." Her hand flew to her mouth. She looked at the document, the numbers blurring. "No," she gasped. "No. He told me he was rich. He told me. He is broke, Elena." I said, my voice hard but not cruel. "He owes $20 million to people who do not use lawyers to collect debts. He has nothing. That $45,000 he promised you, it doesn't exist. He was never going to pay you. Once you testified, once he got the money, he would have cast you aside. Or worse, he would have blackmailed you with your own perjury to keep you quiet." She slumped against the booth, defeated. The hope that had sustained her, the desperate bargain she had made with her morals, had just evaporated. She wasn't saving her daughter. She was just another victim in Brandon's wake. I signed the affidavit," she sobbed quietly. "It is too late. If I tell the truth now, I will go to jail. And Sophia, who will take care of Sophia?" I reached across the table. I did not touch her, but I leaned in, making sure she saw my eyes. "It is not too late," I said. "You were coerced. You were manipulated by a man in a position of power who preyed on your vulnerability. But you have a choice right now. You can stay on his side, and when he goes down, and he will go down, Elena, the FBI is already looking at those transfers, you will go down with him. You will lose your license. You will lose your freedom. And Sophia will be alone." She looked at me, her face streaked with tears, a portrait of absolute despair. "Or," I continued, "you can help me." "Help you?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How? You tell the truth," I said. "You come to court. You recant the affidavit. You tell the judge exactly what Brandon asked you to do. You tell him about the money. You tell him about the promise. But the surgery," she wept. "I can't. I can't lose her. I pulled a checkbook out of my pocket. It wasn't the checkbook of a millionaire. It was my old battered checkbook from the teachers' credit union. I don't have access to Catherine's millions yet, I said. And I don't have $50,000 in this account. But I have my pension savings. I have the money I saved for a rainy day. I wrote a check. I wrote it for $80,000. It was everything I had in the world. It was my safety net. It was my quiet retirement. I tore the check out and placed it on top of the folder. This is a cashier's check, I lied. It wasn't, but I would make it one as soon as the bank opened. I will pay for Sophia's surgery, not as a bribe, not to buy your testimony. I am paying for it because Catherine would have wanted it paid for. She built that foundation to save children, not to be looted by her son. Elena stared at the check. Her hands shook so hard the table vibrated. Why, she whispered. You don't owe me anything. I tried to destroy you. You are a mother, I said, and I am a father. We both know what we would do for our children. Brandon forgot that. He forgot that a parent's love is the strongest force on earth. He tried to use it against you. I am using it to save us both. She looked from the check to me. She saw the fraying collar of my shirt. She saw the tiredness in my face. She knew I wasn't buying her. She knew I was offering her a way out of hell. He will kill me, she whispered. He is a coward, Elena, I said. He is a bully who hides behind money he doesn't have. But you don't have to face him alone. I have lawyers, I have security. We will protect you. But you have to take the first step. You have to choose the truth. She picked up the check. She held it to her chest like a shield. She closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. When she opened them, the fear was still there, but the panic was gone. He recorded it, she said softly. What, Brandon? He recorded our conversation when he gave me the cash. He said it was for insurance. He made me say it was my idea. I smiled. It was a cold, grim smile. Of course he did, I said. Because he doesn't trust anyone. Does he have the recording on his phone? She nodded. Good, I said. Because that recording isn't insurance. It is a confession. I stood up. I put money on the table for the coffee. Come with me, Elena, I said. We have a meeting with a lawyer. And then we are going to get your daughter a new heart. She slid out of the booth. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She stood up straight, pulling her dignity around her like a cloak. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a witness for the prosecution. And as we walked out of the diner into the rain, I knew that the storm was finally breaking. Brandon had built his castle on a swamp of lies, and the ground had just given way. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old paper, a dry, bureaucratic scent that usually signaled boredom. But today, the air was electric. It was the smell of a storm about to break. I sat at the defendant's table next to Mr. Rothstein. My hands were folded on the table, still and heavy. Across the aisle, Brandon leaned back in his chair, checking his reflection in the screen of his phone. He wore a new suit, Italian cut, likely bought on credit he did not have. Vanessa sat behind him in the gallery, scrolling through social media, looking like she was waiting for a flight, rather than a verdict on her husband's soul. Miles Slater the Vulture stood at the podium. He was performing. He waved his arms, pointing an accusatory finger at me, as if I were a demon who had crawled out of the woodwork to devour a helpless old woman. Your Honor, Slater boomed his voice, filling the high-ceilinged room. We are here to correct a grave injustice. We are here to protect the legacy of Catherine Sterling from a predator who used isolation and psychological manipulation to rewrite her final wishes. We have testimony. We have medical opinions. We have the truth. He turned to look at me, a sneer plastered on his face. Brandon smirked, tapping his pen on the table. They thought they had already won. They thought this was just the victory lap. I call Ms. Elena Rosales to the stand, Slater announced. The heavy oak doors opened. Elena walked in. She was not wearing her scrubs today. She wore a simple gray dress and a cardigan. She looked pale, her eyes fixed on the floor as she walked past the gallery. She did not look at me. She did not look at Brandon. Brandon leaned over to whisper something to Slater, a confident, smug grin on his face. He thought he owned her. He thought the $5,000 and the empty promises had bought her silence forever. Elena took the stand. The bailiff swore her in. She sat down, her hands gripping the edges of the chair so hard her knuckles were white. Ms. Rosales Slater began, his voice dropping to a gentle, coaxing tone. You were Catherine Sterling's primary caregiver in her final months, correct? Yes, Elena said. Her voice was small, trembling. And during that time, did you witness Mr. Augustus Sterling interacting with the patient? Yes. Slater walked closer to the witness box, sensing the kill. Tell the court, Ms. Rosales, did you sign an affidavit stating that Mr. Sterling forced Catherine to sign a new will while she was delirious and medicated? Elena took a breath. It was a shaky, ragged sound. She looked up. For the first time, she looked directly at Brandon. His smile faltered. He saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. He saw the absence of fear. I signed that affidavit, Elena said, her voice gaining strength. And is that affidavit true? Slater asked, turning to the judge with a flourish. No, Elena said. The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Slater froze. His smile twitched. I am sorry, Slater said, a hard edge entering his voice. Did you say no? I said no, Elena repeated louder this time. It is a lie. Every word of it is a lie. Catherine Sterling was not delirious. She was lucid. And Mr. Sterling never forced her to do anything. He was the only one who took care of her. Objection! Slater shouted, realizing the ground was crumbling beneath him. Hostile witness. She is changing her testimony. Sit down, Mr. Slater, the judge barked. Continue, Ms. Rosales. Why did you sign a false affidavit? Elena looked at Brandon. He was staring at her with a mixture of shock and fury, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. Because he paid me, Elena said, pointing a shaking finger at my son. Brandon Sterling. He came to the hospital. He knew my daughter needed heart surgery. He knew I was desperate. He gave me $5,000 cash and promised me $45,000 more if I helped him freeze the assets. He told me exactly what to say. He told me to say Gus was abusive. He wrote the lies for me. Liar, Brandon screamed, jumping to his feet. She is lying. My father got to her. He paid her off. The judge banged his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, or I will have you removed. Mr. Rothstein stood up slowly. He adjusted his jacket. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm and authoritative. If I may, we have evidence to support the witness's statement. He walked to the bench and handed a USB drive to the clerk. This is a recording made by Ms. Rosales on the night the bribe was paid. Rothstein explained. It captures Brandon Sterling instructing her on how to commit perjury. It captures him handing her the cash. And it captures him admitting that his mother was perfectly sane but that he needed the money to clear his debts. Play it, the judge ordered. The clerk plugged the drive into the court system. A moment later, Brandon's voice filled the room. It was unmistakable. It was arrogant, cruel, and incriminating. Just sign the paper, Elena. No one cares about the old man. He is nobody. You want your kid to live right, then do what I say. Mom was crazy anyway. We are just helping the process along. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa had stopped scrolling on her phone. She was staring at the back of Brandon's head with a look of pure horror. Brandon had sunk into his chair, his hands covering his face. Mr. Slater, the judge, said, his voice icy. Do you have any explanation for your client suborning perjury and tampering with a witness? Slater was packing his briefcase. He looked at Brandon with disgust. I am withdrawing as counsel, Your Honor, Slater stammered. I was not aware of this. You are not going anywhere, Miles, the judge snapped. Bailiff, bar the doors. No one leaves. But we are not finished, Rothstein said. He did not sit down. He walked back to our table and picked up the heavy file Ms. Sterling and Cole had compiled. He looked like an executioner picking up his axe. Your Honor, the perjury is merely the cover-up. We need to address the crime itself. What crime? The judge asked, leaning forward. We are here for a probate hearing. It began as a probate hearing, Rothstein said. But it is now a crime scene. Rothstein opened the file. He pulled out the flowcharts, the bank transfer records, and the forensic accounting reports. Brandon Sterling did not just try to steal the inheritance, Rothstein declared, his voice rising, filling every corner of the room. He has been stealing from the Sterling Hope Foundation for 6 months. While his mother lay in a coma, he used her digital signature to embezzle $5 million from a grant allocated for pediatric leukemia research. Vanessa gasped loudly in the gallery. Brandon looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wild. That is not true, he croaked. It was a loan. I was going to pay it back. You sent it to a shell company in the Caymans. Rothstein continued, relentless. Which then wired it to a gambling syndicate in Atlantic City to pay off your debts. We have the routing numbers. We have the IP addresses. We have the confirmation from the bank. You stole money meant to save dying children, to save your own kneecaps. Rothstein turned to the judge. Your Honor, this man is not a grieving son. He is a felon. He filed this lawsuit and suborned perjury solely to gain access to the estate so he could cover the hole in the charity's accounts before the end-of-year audit. He used the court as a tool for fraud. The judge looked at the documents Rothstein had placed on the bench. He flipped through them, his face hardening with every page. He looked at the bank transfers. He looked at the charity logs. He looked at the recording transcript. He closed the file. He took off his glasses. He looked at Brandon Sterling not as a judge looks at a litigant, but as a society looks at a parasite. This court finds that the plaintiff, Brandon Sterling, has come with unclean hands, the judge said, his voice low and dangerous. Motion for the injunction is denied. The will of Catherine Sterling stands valid and uncontested. But the judge continued, raising his hand to silence Brandon's whimper of protest. That is the least of your problems, Mr. Sterling. The judge pressed a button on his desk. Bailiff, take Mr. Sterling into custody. What? Brandon shrieked, standing up and knocking his chair over. You cannot arrest me. This is civil court. It was civil court, the judge said. I am transferring this matter to the district attorney's office immediately. Based on the evidence presented, I am holding you in contempt of court and remanding you on suspicion of wire fraud, embezzlement, and witness tampering. Bail is denied. You are a flight risk. The bailiffs moved in. They were not the polite security guards from the funeral. They were officers of the law, and they had heard the recording. They had heard about the sick children. They grabbed Brandon by the arms, twisting them behind his back. Dad. Brandon screamed, looking at me with wild, terrified eyes. Dad, do something. Tell them I am your son. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a final period at the end of a long, tragic sentence. I stood up. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had thrown a $100 bill at me. I looked at the man who had stolen from children. I did do something, Brandon, I said softly. I stopped you. The metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a sound that felt like a guillotine dropping on his future. Brandon stopped screaming. He went limp in the grip of the bailiffs, his legs buckling under the weight of his new reality. He looked small. For all his bluster, for all his talk of empires and legacies, stripped of his freedom, he was just a frightened man in a suit he could not afford. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost of the son I once knew. I turned my head toward the gallery. Vanessa was standing up. She was moving with the frantic energy of a rat sensing the ship going down. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at me. She looked at her left hand. With a violent, jerky motion, she tore the diamond engagement ring off her finger. It was a ring Brandon had bought with money stolen from cancer research. She dropped it on the wooden bench. It clattered loudly in the silent room, spinning for a moment before coming to rest in the dust. She turned and ran. The sound of her high heels clicking rapidly against the floor tiles echoed off the walls. She pushed through the double doors without looking back once. She left him there. She left him the moment his utility to her expired. Brandon watched her go. He watched the woman he had betrayed his family for walk out of his life the second the handcuffs went on. His head whipped around to face me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terror so raw it was hard to look at. "Dad," he sobbed. The word hung in the air. He hadn't called me Dad in 20 years. He called me Gus. He called me the old man. He called me a loser. But now, facing the abyss of a federal prison cell, he remembered who I was. "Dad. Please," he begged, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face and dripping onto his expensive silk tie. "You have the money now. You have the millions. You can fix this. You can hire better lawyers. You can pay them off. Please, Dad. I am your son. Do not let them take me." The bailiffs hoisted him up, dragging him toward the side door that led to the holding cells. He fought them, twisting his body, reaching out toward me with his cuffed hands as if I were a lifeline, and he was drowning in a dark ocean. "Tell them," he screamed. "Tell them it was a mistake. I will sign anything. I will give it all back." "Dad," I stood there motionless. I looked at him. I looked at the boy who used to run into my arms when it thundered. I looked at the teenager who stopped speaking to me because I drove a Ford. I looked at the man who stole from dying children to pay a bookie. I searched my heart for anger. I expected to feel vindication. I expected to feel the triumph of justice. But I felt none of those things. As I looked at my son being dragged away, screaming my name, I felt only a deep, crushing pity. I pitied him. Not because he was going to prison, but because he had lived 40 years on this earth without ever learning what it meant to be a man. He had chased gold and found only iron bars. He had chased status and found only shame. I did not speak. There was nothing left to say. I just looked at him with eyes that were tired and old and empty of the love he had squandered. The bailiffs pushed him through the heavy metal door. I saw his face one last time, a mask of absolute despair, before the door slammed shut with a final resounding boom. The screaming stopped. The room was silent. I was the only Sterling left standing. Mr. Rothstein sat alone at the defense table, surrounded by stacks of legal binders that were now just history books. The courtroom was empty, save for the court reporter packing up her machine and the bailiff guarding the side door where my son had vanished. The silence was heavy, but it was not oppressive. It was the clean, sterile silence that comes after a storm has scrubbed the air. Rothstein looked at me. He did not offer congratulations. He knew better. He pushed a heavy document toward me across the polished wood. It was the deed of transfer for the assets. The keys to the kingdom. $250 million in liquid capital, property, and stock. It was enough money to buy countries. It was enough money to never worry again. "It is yours," Gus Rothstein said softly. "The judge ruled. The will stands. You are the sole beneficiary." I looked at the paper. I saw the numbers. I saw the power they represented. And I saw exactly what that power had done to my wife and my son. It had isolated one and destroyed the other. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen, the kind I used to grade history exams. "Do you have the other paperwork?" I asked. Rothstein nodded. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a separate file. It was thinner, simpler. The Catherine Sterling Scholarship Fund, he read. Dedicated to providing full tuition for underprivileged students in the sciences, and the Pediatric Oncology Grant. I pulled the papers toward me. I did not hesitate. I did not think about the yachts I could buy or the penthouses I could live in. I thought about the kids who needed a chance, the kind of chance Catherine had fought for, the kind of chance Brandon had thrown away. I signed my name, Augustus Sterling. With each stroke of the pen, I felt lighter. I signed away the mansion in the Hamptons. I signed away the Park Avenue apartment. I signed away the stock portfolio. I transferred every single cent of the $250 million into the charitable trust. I kept two things: my house in Queens because it was home, and my old Ford truck because it still ran. "It is done," Rothstein said, witnessing the signature. "You are a poor man again, Mr. Sterling." I stood up. I buttoned my torn coat. I looked at the lawyer who had been my only ally in this war. "No, Mr. Rothstein," I said. "I was poor when I walked in here. Now I am free." I walked out of the courthouse. The reporters were gone, chasing the police van that carried Brandon. The steps were empty. The sun had come out, piercing through the gray clouds that had hung over the city for weeks. The air smelled of wet pavement and exhaust, the perfume of New York. I walked 3 blocks to a small park. It wasn't Central Park. It was just a patch of green with a few pigeons and a rusted swing set. There was an ice cream truck parked on the corner playing a tinny, cheerful tune. I walked up to the window. I dug into my pocket and pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills. "1 vanilla cone, please," I said. The man handed me the ice cream wrapped in a thin napkin. I sat down on a wooden bench, the paint peeling under my fingers. I took a bite. It was cold and sweet and simple. I watched a group of children playing tag on the grass. I listened to the distant hum of traffic. I thought about Brandon sitting in a cell. I hoped, truly hoped, that stripped of the money he might finally find himself. I thought about Catherine finally resting without the weight of her empire crushing her chest. I took another bite of my $2 ice cream. I looked at my scuffed shoes. I felt the cool breeze on my face. I didn't have $250 million. I didn't have a legacy to protect. I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the sun warm my face. For the first time in 30 years, the war was over. I was Augustus Sterling. I was a history teacher. And as I sat there in the park eating my cone, I realized I had never been richer. Looking back, I realized that the greatest inheritance a parent can give is not a trust fund, but a moral compass. Money is a magnifying glass. It does not change who you are, it only reveals it. Brandon thought wealth was a right, and it became his prison. Catherine thought it was a legacy, and it became her regret. I found that true wealth isn't measured in millions, but in the freedom of a clear conscience. Peace is the only luxury that cannot be bought, and integrity is the only asset that no judge, no thief, and no son can ever take away. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of justice. Let me know in the comments. Would you have kept the millions, or would you have chosen freedom like I did?